Lars Ekström had already begun reading the revised agreement when Brigitte Bardot placed both hands flat on the boardroom table. 9 board members and 2 legal representatives were watching the presentation, their copies of the contract already open. Ekström read the first removed approval right aloud, without once looking toward her end of the table. He stood at the head of the long table with the bound folder open in front of him, reading the clauses in the steady procedural voice of a man presenting a decision that had already been finalized. Several board members had already turned their chairs toward him before he reached the end of his first paragraph. Their notebooks were open, and their pens hovered above the pages. The bound folder at Bardot's seat remained closed. Further down the same table, Bardot sat with her hands flat on the surface, the bound folder at her seat still closed. Several board members had turned toward Ekström before he reached the end of his opening paragraph. Their chairs had rotated incrementally from the center of the table toward the head position, their notebooks open, their pens held above the pages in the ready position of people who had been in sessions like this one before. Bardot sat further down the same table with both hands resting flat on the surface, her back straight, her position unchanged from the moment she had taken her seat. She did not adjust her posture in response to the board member's movement. She did not reach toward the closed folder placed at her table position. She kept her hands flat and her eyes forward. The press journalists along the side wall had their credentials clipped to their jackets and their notebooks open from the moment the session opened. All eyes turned toward Ekström as he placed his hand flat on the bound folder and named the specific clause under revision, his palm pressing the open pages down against the table surface as he spoke the clause number aloud. The legal representatives at the far end of the table had their own copies of the document already open in front of them. The pages turned to the section Ekström had just named, held flat by one hand each. The boardroom held its arrangement around the table without adjustment. The bound folder at Bardot's table position remained closed, its cover facing upward, the colored tab marking the signature page visible at the folder's right edge. Board members who had already oriented their chairs toward the head of the table remained in that position. Bardot did not look at the board members on either side of her. She looked at the closed folder on the table surface directly in front of her, and then she looked at Ekström. If you're interested in untold stories from cinema's golden age, subscribe now. This is a fictionalized dramatization inspired by real public figures and historical settings. It does not depict a documented event. The session had been arranged as a formal co-production review under the Institute's standard procedural framework. Ekström had distributed a printed agenda to each board member before the session opened. A single page, dated and headed with the Institute's name, the co-production revision listed as the first and primary agenda item. The bound folder had been placed at each seat along the table before Bardot arrived, positioned at the upper right corner of each place setting. The journalists along the wall held accreditation from Swedish national outlets and from 2 international press agencies, whose coverage reached Paris and London. Their presence at a procedural session of this kind was not standard. It had been arranged. Ekström's position as Director General of the Svenska Filminstitutet gave his decisions on co-production terms a reach that extended beyond the Institute's own operations. His formal endorsement unlocked distribution access across the Scandinavian network and determined whether a production could carry the Institute's certification in international festival submissions. The board members seated around the table had served across multiple production cycles under his directorship and had been present at previous sessions where his presentations had resulted in signed agreements before the agenda's first item was closed. His sessions ran in a recognizable structure: opening remarks, clause-by-clause presentation, signature at the designated page. The bound folder had been prepared and assembled before the session. Each copy, the one at Ekström's head position, the ones in front of the legal representatives, and the one placed at Bardot's seat, had been produced from the same document and collated in the same sequence. The signature page in each copy had been tabbed with a colored marker at its right edge, and a pen had been placed beside each folder before the room was open to participants. The pen beside Bardot's copy was still on the table where the Institute staff had left it, parallel to the folder's right edge, untouched. The journalists along the sidewall had been writing in steady strokes since Ekström began his opening remarks. Their notebooks were angled toward the head of the table, and their pens had not slowed between sentences. One journalist had already turned from the first page of his notebook to the second by the time Ekström reached the third clause of the revision section. The printed agenda at each board member's seat had been placed with the first item facing upward, and several board members had their agendas open beside their notebooks with the revision item underlined. Bardot had been present in the boardroom when Ekström arrived. She had entered after the board members were seated and after the legal representatives had taken their positions at the far end of the table. The bound folder had been at her assigned seat when she sat down, positioned as it was at every other seat, and she had placed her hands on the table on either side of it without opening it or moving it. When Ekström began speaking, she had looked at him directly and had not looked away. By the time he named the first removed approval right, she had not shifted her hands, had not opened the folder, and had not looked at the board members to either side of her. Ekström addressed the board without directing his remarks toward Bardot's end of the table. He referenced the open folder in front of him as he named each clause, pressing his palm flat against the relevant page as he read the clause number aloud, and then lifting his hand as he moved to the next point. His language was procedural from the first sentence, the vocabulary of a formal presentation, rather than a negotiation, each term specific and each sentence constructed to leave no room for a qualifying response. The journalists along the wall were writing before he reached the second clause. One legal representative uncapped his pen and underlined a passage in his copy without looking up. He did not frame the revision as open to discussion. He presented each removed approval right as a condition, using the word condition once in the opening of the revision section and then building each subsequent clause on that foundation without restating it. His hand returned to the folder between each clause, pressing the pages flat before he continued to the next point. One legal representative had his copy open at the same page as Ekström's and was following the text with his finger as Ekström read, the fingertip moving along the lines without pausing. Bardot's folder remained closed. She had not moved her hands from the table's surface. The board members further down the table had shifted their gaze between the folder in front of Ekström and Bardot's position as he worked through the revision section. The shift was not uniform. Some looked toward her immediately when a clause was named. Others looked at their own notebooks, but by the midpoint of the revision section, several chairs along both sides of the table had their occupants' bodies angled slightly toward her end rather than fully toward the head. Their pens had slowed. Two had set their pens against their notebooks without closing them, the nibs resting against the open pages. Ekström continued through the revision section without acknowledging the change in the room's orientation. He named each removed approval right in sequence. The approval right over the final cut, the approval right over international distribution edits, the approval right over the promotional materials, and after each one he moved directly to the next without pause. His voice held the same flat carrying register throughout. The journalists along the wall had not looked up from their notebooks. One had drawn a vertical line down the margin of his page beside the clause section and was writing against it in a compressed hand. The legal representatives at the far end of the table had exchanged a brief glance when Ekström named the final removed approval right. The exchange lasted less than 2 seconds, a look from one to the other, a small adjustment of the head, a return to the document in front of each of them, and did not produce any words. Both copies remained open on the table at the same page. Neither legal representative moved his pen to the page after the glance. Bardot's folder was still closed on the table in front of her, its colored tab still visible at the right edge, the pen beside it still parallel and untouched. Several board members who had been writing continuously through the opening section had slowed their pens during the revision clauses. Two had stopped writing entirely without closing their notebooks, the pens resting against the open pages with the last written line incomplete. Ekström had not altered his pace or changed the volume of his voice. He moved from the revision clauses into the section addressing the revised production timeline, his hand pressing the next page flat against the table as he turned to it. The journalists along the side wall maintained their pace through the revision section and into the timeline section. One had filled the second page of his notebook and turned to a third without interrupting his writing. The others were still on their second pages, their shorthand moving in tight, consistent lines across the paper. None of them had looked up from their notebooks since Ekström named the first clause. The bound folder at Bardot's position on the table had not moved. Its tab was still visible, its cover still facing upward, its pen still beside it. Board members on both sides of the table had their chairs angled toward the head position and their materials, notebooks, agendas, in some cases their own copies of the folder, open in front of them. The board members nearest to Bardot had looked at her during the revision section and returned their gaze to the head of the table. Her hands were flat on the table on either side of the closed folder. The folder's cover was smooth and unmarked, its pages undisturbed beneath it, the tab at its right edge pointing upward. Ekström reached the final section of the presentation, the section addressing the formal registration timeline and the date by which the signed agreement would need to be returned to the Institute's legal office. He turned to the last page of his own copy as he began this section, his hand pressing it flat in the same gesture he had used throughout. The board members who had been writing resumed their pens at the start of this section. The journalists along the wall turned to fresh pages in their notebooks. The legal representatives had both closed their copies to the front page and were looking at the head of the table. Ekström completed the timeline section and paused. The pause was procedural, the same brief stop he had used between sections throughout the presentation, and it produced the same small adjustment across the room. Chairs shifting, pens repositioning, weight redistributing. One legal representative set his closed copy to one side of his place at the table. A board member near the middle of the table turned from his notebook to the printed agenda beside it and back again. The bound folder at Bardot's position remained closed, the pen beside it parallel and untouched, the tab at the right edge unchanged. Bardot opened the bound folder. The movement was unhurried. Her right hand moved from the table surface to the folder's cover, lifted it, and held it open. She turned through the pages from the front, moving in consistent, unhurried increments without stopping at the revision section or the timeline section until she reached the tabbed signature page near the back of the document. She held the open folder with one hand and removed the signature page from its position with the other, separating it cleanly from the pages beneath it. She placed the signature page flat on the table in front of her with both hands, face upward, and then took the remainder of the bound folder, the cover, the revision section, the timeline section, all pages except the one now on the table, and slid it back across the table surface toward Ekström's end. The folder traveled along the table and came to rest in front of his position. She returned both hands to the table surface, flat, one on either side of the signature page. She did not speak. The room went quiet. Ekström's voice had stopped before the folder reached him. It had stopped at the moment Bardot's hands moved to the cover, and it had not resumed as the folder traveled the length of the table, and it had not resumed when the folder came to rest in front of him. Board members who had been writing stopped. The journalists along the wall stopped. The sound of pens on paper, which had been the room's consistent undercurrent since the session opened, was gone. Ekström looked at the returned folder in front of him. It sat between his own copy and the near edge of the table, its pages loose where the signature page had been removed. The colored tab that had marked that page now attached to nothing. The tabbed edge of the folder's back section open and empty. He did not look at Bardot. He did not look at the board members along the table. He looked at the folder, at the empty tab, at the open back section, with his hand still resting flat on his own open copy beside it. The two legal representatives looked at each other across the width of the table end. The exchange was visible, a direct look from one face to the other, held for several seconds, and neither of them spoke during it. One of them looked down at his own closed copy on the table in front of him, then back at the unsigned returned folder in front of Ekström. He did not reopen his copy. He set both hands flat on the table on either side of it. Several board members had set their pens down within the first moments of the folder's return. The pens rested against their open notebooks on the table surface. Not capped, not put away, simply set down mid-session. Two board members who had been leaning toward the head of the table shifted back in their chairs without turning their bodies away from Ekström's position. Their notebooks remained open in front of them with the last written lines incomplete. The journalists along the side wall had stopped writing simultaneously with the room, Their pens were held above their open notebooks in the position of hands that had been mid-stroke when something stopped them. Several had shifted their eyes from Ekström to the signature page sitting on the table in front of Bardot, face up, unsigned, between her hands, and then back to the returned folder in front of Ekström. One legal representative placed both hands flat on the table on either side of his closed copy without opening it. He looked at the unsigned folder at the head of the table, then at the signature page in front of Bardot, then at Ekström. He did not speak. His hands remained flat on the table, pressing lightly against the surface, and he did not move them. No one moved. The unsigned folder sat in front of Ekström with its empty tab facing upward. The signature page sat in front of Bardot, face up, its printed lines and blank signature field visible to the room between her two flat hands. Ekström had not resumed speaking. He had not touched the return folder or moved it from where it had come to rest. 5 seconds passed. Ekström looked along the table toward the board members. Several of them were already looking back at him. One board member near the middle of the table had his pen raised above his notebook page, lifted from the surface in the moment the folder was returned, still held above the paper, not writing, not lowered. Another board member at the far end of the table, near the legal representatives, had turned his chair slightly so that both Ekström's position and Bardot's position were visible from where he sat. 10 seconds passed. One legal representative shifted forward in his chair. His weight moved toward the table edge, his hands pressing slightly harder against the surface. And then he stopped the movement and remained in that forward position, without speaking or reaching for anything. He looked at the table between his hands and then up at Ekström. The journalists along the wall had not resumed writing. Their notebooks were open, their pens were held, and their eyes were moving between the returned folder and the signature page in two visible lines of attention across the room. 15 seconds passed. When Ekström spoke again, his voice was at a lower register than it had maintained throughout the presentation. The sentence he produced was short, a procedural question directed toward the legal representatives at the far end of the table, not addressed to the board or to Bardot, and it did not connect to the timeline section where he had paused before the folder was returned. One legal representative answered in a brief phrase. The answer was audible to the front half of the table. Several board members turned toward the exchange. Several did not. The board members who had stopped writing during the folder's return did not resume their earlier pace. They began speaking to one another in low voices across the table, exchanges of 2 or 3 words, brief and lateral, moving between neighbors rather than addressed to the head of the table. The formal direction of the session, which had moved from Ekström outward to the board since the opening remarks, had stopped moving in that direction. Ekström did not pick up the returned folder or attempt to continue the presentation from the point where it had stopped. The unsigned folder remained in front of Ekström's position for the full remaining duration of the session. He did not reopen it, did not pass it to the legal representatives, did not move it to one side of his own materials. The signature page remained in front of Bardot on the open table surface, face up and unsigned, between her hands. The journalists along the wall resumed writing before the session formally closed. Their pens returned to their pages and moved in the shorter strokes of people recording a room rather than transcribing a presentation. When the board members collected their agendas and the legal representatives gathered their copies from the table, the signature page was still where Bardot had placed it. The institute staff member who cleared the table afterward collected it with the remaining materials. It left the room unsigned.